Thank you very much. Yep, thank you, Andrew. So I was going to apologise for the title of the talk, which was a phrase that was coined by my co-author, as it were, Jevon Hilder, A Sight for Sore Eyes. But actually, the more I thought about it, the Zohr discovery has done more than just change the way the gas market is going to work in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's done more than change, in fact, the geopolitics of the Eastern Mediterranean, and certainly done more than change just the enthusiasm that the industry has for the Eastern Mediterranean. It's actually changed the way I look at seismic now. And I want to take you through the rationale behind that and take you on a journey from Zohr itself to not only the Zohr analogues that you might be familiar with, but some other ones that we've seen that, that may be just the future of the more central part of the Mediterranean. So let's begin this journey. So a couple of years ago, Jevon and I went on a tour of the Eastern Mediterranean, visited lots of the operators in this part of the world, and it was a pretty moribund story. The feeling was the Nile Delta was more or less played out. The work offshore Israel seemed to have reached its apogee. Lebanon was stuck in a license round it couldn't quite finish, and we hadn't quite got round to finding much exploration potential offshore Cyprus, so that this whole area of the Eastern Mediterranean seemed really, really quiet. And that all changed, and it changed with the Zohr discovery. And now, since because of Zohr, effectively, we've now had license rounds in Cyprus. We are expecting a rejuvenation of the Lebanon license round perhaps by the end of this year. I know Andrew's a big supporter of that. So if not by the end of the meeting today, then certainly by the end of the year, we'd see the decrees being signed by the government in Lebanon, who finally got their act together. And the Israelis have also got a license round that is ongoing, and the Egyptians too have been licensing this deep water acreage, and it's all been because of one discovery, and that was the Zohr discovery. Now, I expect we've all seen this this seismic line that IEOC, which is ENI in in Egypt, they published this in 2014. So I think it's fair game, and what we see here is a carbonate buildup of the carbonate started building up probably in the late Cretaceous, but the main part of this edifice and the bit where the hydrocarbons are is as young as early Miocene in age, and it's an early Miocene build-up surrounded by Miocene shales, which provide the biogenic gas which fuels the system. But crucially, it's sealed by the Messinian salt. So this Miocene, early Miocene build-up kept its head clear of the Miocene shales until the Messinian salt was deposited on the top. And I think that this is probably what's going to be the key play element for Zohr, is whether these carbonate buildups have a covering of Messinian salt or not. So ENI have been really generous with the amount of material that they've put out and published about the Zohr discovery. Some of the facts that come out of this are just astonishing. A 643-metre gas column, and they've even published the RFT plot, and it's the sharpest RFT plot I've ever seen even from a clastic reservoir. It's just a rifle straight gas column that is as high as they show here, as high as 4 Cheops pyramids stood one on top of the other. Now, of course, that helps everybody because we've all seen 4 Cheops pyramids sitting one on top of each other, so we can now really get a feel for, oh yeah, this is just like that. But anyway, it's astonishingly big, and it's quite a surprise. The other great thing that they've published is that the gas-water contact, as they map it out, of Zohr stops exactly at the border between Egypt and Cyprus, and that's how nature works. So what's the model? The model here is that we're looking at a reef, and it's an atoll reef. There's a really beautiful example of this just to help us conceptualize it. And so what we see on this seismic line, which is an east-west seismic line, is over on the west side we have some reef, which would be equivalent to this part of the structure, matched by a similar part on the east side. And inside you have a lagoon, and in there you'd get a sort of bioclastic type of deposit, very fine-grained, probably very tight, probably no reservoir at all in this central part. But what we do get is some good reflectivity. So if we look at this seismic line, what we're looking for is a period of very poor reflectivity. The reef is not going to make very good reflectivity, and then a very good reflectivity part, and then a poor reflectivity part. So in simplistic my terms, as it were, as an explorer, I'm looking on a seismic line, I see good reflectivity, it all goes to crap here, and then, sorry about that, and then it goes all nice and good reflectivity, and then get more crap, and then we're out of it. So that's what we're looking for when we're looking for ZOR analogues. And I think that's the key for exploration in this part of the world. So these things have been seen before, and our good friend Joe Pape, who's sitting just over there, he spotted these build-ups like years ago on spectrum data, and good luck to him, because this is an example of data that we had from 2000, and you can see this is the salt in here, the Messinian salt, and you can see something sticking up into the salt. And Joe was smart enough to think that that might be a carbonate buildup. This penny didn't drop for me until they actually made the discovery, I'll admit that. So anyway, so there's the salt on the top. And I think that's the key play element. That's what we've got to look for. We've got to look for this thick Messinian salt sitting on top of the carbonate buildup. Because there are examples that have been drilled on the eastern side of the basin of these carbonate buildups. In fact, they've drilled loads and loads and loads of these carbonate buildups, and they've almost never worked. You occasionally get the odd oil or gas show, but in general, they never work. And what's different about this one is that it's got a very thick salt layer on top of it. So I think that's the key play element for ZOR. Of course, now we've reprocessed this data. There's an example, a bit like Øystein could show. This is the data that just fell out of the processing center about a week ago. It's broadband reprocessing of that old 2000 data. And we're starting even to even pick out reflectivity within the carbonate buildup. So we're really excited about this broadband processing that comes out. I mean, broadband itself, usually I'm pretty dismissive of it because it just looks like you've hit the embossed button in Photoshop and you're feeling very pleased with yourself. But actually, in specific cases, if you're looking for sedimentology, broadband's the key. That's the weapon of choice, and that'll show you what's going on. So we're really quite excited about this innovation in our technology. It's letting us look at the sedimentology of the inner parts of ZOR. Now here's, just want to step it back a little bit. Here's a regional line running down, running from near the Nile Delta cone in Egypt, running up towards the Eratosthenes seamount, which I'll talk about in a little while. And I thought it was worth showing this because in the southern part of this line, which is over here, there's very little salt. And that's not because the salt wasn't deposited there, but as the Nile Delta cone has prograded out from Egypt, it's like a rolling pin. It's pushed the salt in front of it. And what it's left us with is this big pile of salt right at the far end of the Nile Delta cone. And that, although there may have been salt on top of the this seamounts and the ZOR atolls, that there may have been some salt on that. It's thickened that up, thickened that whole sequence up. And so we've developed this really thick salt sequence on the top of the atolls. And I think that this is the key part of the play fairway, and that's maybe going to tell us how we explore and find some more of these ZOR-type features. Okay, so first thing, as soon as ZOR was discovered, I kicked myself in the head because I hadn't spotted it beforehand. Joe had. But, we went out and scurried around our data to look for some more ZORs. And immediately we found one just sitting to the north of Zohr, a Zohr analogue. So here's the Messinian salt unit in here, and we have this unconformity that runs along here. That's the base of the salt. And you can see units that are running unconformably into that base of the salt. This is another carbonate buildup, just the same style as Zohr. And in fact, if we compare it, this is another line that runs through this feature here. And you can just briefly see you've got poor quality reflectivity, good quality reflectivity, that's the lagoon, poor quality reflectivity, that's the reef. So it's very, very similar sort of structure, except it's about 4 or 5 times bigger than Zohr. So Zohr itself is 30 TCF. I'm not sure if we believe that after one well. They've now drilled, I think, 3, maybe 4 wells into it. How many? 7. They've now drilled 7 wells into it, apparently. And they're still coming out with a number like 30 TCF as a potential resource size. So this guy, just to the northwest, is perhaps 4 or 5 times bigger than that. But as I hope to show you, you ain't seen nothing yet. As we look at that line, so that's that guy there that we were just looking at there. If we look at a line that runs east to west, running through that feature, you just see one after another, running right out into the Herodotus Basin, out into the area that Øystein was showing us just in the talk before. And we're seeing build-up after build-up after build-up with thick salt on top of it. That's the key. We're seeing that thick Messinian salt. When we get into the Herodotus, previously it had looked fairly horrendous because there was so much complexity in the salt that the seismic beneath the salt was quite hard to interpret. But now, with our Zohr eyes on, we can see these carbonate build-ups time and time again as we go across to the west. As just an example, there's a couple of them here. So we put Zohr eyes on here. This is salt, something sticking up into the salt that's building up below it. It's just the same as Zohr. This one is probably the same size as Zohr, so a mere 30 TCF potential play. But there are just loads of these things. And it's quite good fun. Here's the last one going out towards the west is another build-up in here, the salt through here, something sticking up into the salt. So we see quite a lot of these things, and we had quite a lot of fun mapping them out, because you can map out the future for the Eastern Mediterranean. You could take the view that Zohr was a freak. We just drilled one of these carbonate build-ups, and it's a freak. None of the others are going to work. You could take that view. On the other hand, you could say, if we can find the same play elements covering another of these carbonate build-ups, why the heck wouldn't the others work? And what you need to find is the thick salt with the carbonate build-up sticking into the thick salt. You need to be surrounded by Miocene mudstones that can provide the organic material for the biogenic methane. Why on earth wouldn't they work? So we started to think then on a regional scale. This is really exciting. And one of the features in this area that these atolls seem to be surrounding is something called the Eratosthenes carbonate. Well, we call it the Eratosthenes carbonate platform. People are more familiar about calling it the Eratosthenes seamount. It's not a seamount, so don't call it that. It's something different. It's a carbonate platform. And it's really interesting because there's about 8 kilometers of platform carbonates that have been deposited there through the Cretaceous. So I'll come back to this theme in a minute. Cretaceous, in the whole of this part of the Mediterranean, was really boring. Nothing happened. You just get carbonate being deposited on carbonate on carbonate. Carbonate platforms, they just grew and grew and grew, and the basin slowly subsided. Nothing happening apart from that. And this has generated the Eratosthenes carbonate platform. Now, that Eratosthenes carbonate platform is huge, much bigger than we'd previously suspected, and extends far off into Herodotus. So mapping out the Eratosthenes platform would be quite an interesting thing to do. Analogues for the Eratosthenes platform include offshore Cuba and Bahamas and so forth. Okay, just to look at what might be happening at the edge of this carbonate platform, I've done something you should never do. Take two completely unrelated bits of geology and stick them next to each other, just to try and make a facile point. So, here we are. We have a point here, we have a seismic line here from the Adriatic, southern Adriatic, offshore Croatia, and you see this beautiful carbonate platform margin with an onlap of clastics onto the carbonate platform margin, and I've just boshed it next to the Eratosthenes seamount, and we see the same thing, carbonate platform margin and onlap of clastics against it. The one difference between Eratosthenes seamount, Eratosthenes carbonate platform and the one in the southern part of the Adriatic is the Messinian salt. It's not present here, it's an unconformity here, too far up dip for the salt. But in the Eratosthenes area, very, very thick salt. And this is the northern Levant thick Messinian salt sequence. And actually we got quite interested in the edges of this carbonate platform. So let's just show you a couple of examples. This one running up against the Eratosthenes seamount here. This is the salt section in there, the Messinian salt. And then they've got some knobble is sticking up into this salt. Here, that's that's a hard kick here. So that what am I talking about? That's a soft kick here. We're going from fast salt into soft mudstone. You see the same thing on this side, a soft kick. And right in the middle, you've got fast salt and then even faster carbonate. That is a carbonate sticking up into the Messinian salt writ large, and its orthogonal is this line here. This is the same feature with the salt on the top of it. Interestingly, here we've managed to get Messinian salt on the top of the Eratosthenes platform margin edge, which is where you'd expect to find the porosity, I guess, on a carbonate platform margin edge. But here we've managed to do it by sliding this salt from the northern Levant basin, just pushing it gently over the top. It's more like creep. It's less dramatic than the Nile Delta sort of forced rolling out of the salt in front of the clastic prison. Here the salt has just crept over the top of the carbonate platform margin edge, but who cares? It's generating the right geometry, which is that you've got thick salt on top of your carbonate surrounded by good source rock for your biogenic gas. So here we are. We can map out the Eratosthenes platform now, and it's much bigger than just around Zor. This is like a zone where you get lots of these atolls forming on the Eratosthenes platform, which we can map out heading down towards Egypt. And on the other side of this deep basin, and that was the carbonate platform margin edge we were just looking at, on the other side of the deep basin, here's deep water Lebanon. And there are places where they get carbonate, where you get these atolls forming on the eastern side of that deep basin as well. The Myra well is a good example of a well that was drilled into a carbonate buildup. But there was not a thick Messinian salt on the top. You went from Miocene clastics, which no doubt has some thief zone sands in them, and then into the carbonate. So that's why Myra didn't work. But it doesn't mean to say that there won't be other places in Lebanon and offshore Israel where you'll be able to find the right sort of geometry. Anyway, we can map out across the Eratosthenes platform now, map out all these little atolls. Here we go, lots of these atolls. They're just everywhere. And they all have the same sort of play elements. Thick salt, carbonate building up into the salt and surrounded by Miocene source rock. So why shouldn't they all work? Why shouldn't they all work? I can't think of a single reason. I think it's going to be really exciting. So Andrew knows what it's like to explore in carbonate reservoirs. Normally, you wouldn't wish it on your worst enemy because you could drill one well and you find good porosity, drill another well 10 feet to the right, and you find no porosity. Hey, but this doesn't seem to be happening on Zor. And if it's the same formation model for all of these atolls, maybe it's just going to happen again and again and again. So what happens in that deep basin? So here's the Eratosthenes platform. You've got these atolls forming here in the early Miocene. And then something else remarkable happens in the early Miocene. This deep basin here gets filled with the clastics. And he's like, what? Normally, you can think that clastics and carbonates you don't get them in the same area doing useful things to each other, because normally clastics just kill off carbonate platforms. But here, clastics had come into the basin in the early Miocene and just filled this basin up. Something really important happened in the early part of the Tertiary to the whole part of the Eastern Mediterranean, and that's where we're going to go next. But the most important thing that happened to the area of that deep basin is that the Nile stopped flowing into the Niger and started flowing north. And it flowed north from the early Tertiary and brought in vast amounts of sandstones, which piled out into this deep basin offshore Lebanon. Which is why, when the Lebanese signed that decree in the next few minutes, and the Lebanese license round is now on, why it'll be so important, because there's huge structures offshore Lebanon, there may even be an oil story, but there's huge structures offshore Lebanon just waiting to be explored. And these sands are sitting in that deep basin. So the effect of this deep basin is effectively to shelter the Eratosthenes carbonate platform from the clastics that are coming into the basin, so that the clastics are brought in. When the Nile starts flowing into the Mediterranean, the clastics come in and they all get diverted off into that deep basin offshore Lebanon. And that leaves the Eratosthenes carbonate platform as a place where carbonates can grow. But they're having a hell of a time of it, because whilst they've spent the whole of the Cretaceous, where there's a very big carbonate platform and carbonates are being deposited over a huge, huge area, something is desperately changing so that we're forming these atolls. So what might it be? And that's where we're going to go next. So something happens to the whole of the Eratosthenes platform that changes the depositional environment from a carbonate platform growth into these specific atoll growths. And the answer, I think, is dynamic topography. It's in variations in the asthenosphere that Africa is being dragged across that change the depositional setting of the Mediterranean. Now, dynamic topography is like, it's the fat badger of this talk. I just cannot fit it into the set at all. But the people that have done a lot of this work, Nicky White and company, are busy building up the story of dynamic topography. And what we're seeing with dynamic topography are changes in the level of the crust that tell us where convection cells are in the mantle. And they've created this most amazing map. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but it's the most profound, life-changing map I'd seen in a long time. And these are what they call the residuals on the base of the crust. And this is showing us where mantle is upwelling and where it's downwelling. Because where it comes up, it lifts the crust, and when it goes down, it lowers the crust. And to me, it's incredibly profound because for several reasons. The firstly is that the level of, or the size of the convection cells is very, very small. And that's not what we expect at all. So each of those blue to red transitions is the mantle is coming up and then it's going down again. And the wavelength of these convection cells is very, very small. So all of those models, all of the models that we've had in our heads about how plate tectonics work, you just chuck them in a bin, because plate tectonics does not work in the way you think it does. Plates are not moving around because of the convection of the mantle. They're not. So just don't have to think about that anymore. And that's quite a profound type of understanding. And you know that that's true if you believe that this map here, the residual map, is showing you the convection cells in the mantle, because it's on a much smaller scale than individual plates. So how would a plate know which direction to go if it's being pulled in all sorts of different directions? And often, if you have a direction that you think that the plate should move with these convection cells, it's in the reverse direction to which they're actually moving. So I'm pretty sure we're going to just have to kick plate tectonics as we currently understand it to one side and run it in a different way. Anyway, back to back to exploration. So what I think happens is, oh yeah, sorry, one last thing. Okay, what we can see here is I've got Africa moving since the opening of the Atlantic, since the early part of the Cretaceous, Africa moving and rotating as it goes north. And what it does, it's moving over these convection cells. So there are basins that are being pulled down and lifted up, pulled down, lifted up as the basins are being dragged over the mantle convection cells underneath. It's quite a profound concept. And what happens, I think, to the Mediterranean is that at the end of the tertiary, we go from a situation where the Mediterranean is like being supported by an upward welling convection, and then it starts to subside incredibly rapidly. So all through the Cretaceous, as I say, Mediterranean, boring, 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 just depositing this carbonate platforms, nothing's going on, no clastics are coming in. Early tertiary all starts to subside really quickly, and the Nile it's changing the way the whole crust works. So the Nile starts flowing to the north, bringing clastics in for the first time, and those big carbonate platforms are subsiding so quickly that the carbonates, they need to circle wagons, and they need to get together and form these atolls to keep up with this increased rate of subsidence. Eventually, by the end of the early Miocene, they can't do it, and they just get drowned, and they are taken below the photic zone, and then that's the end of those carbonate buildups. But all over, this happens all over the Eratosthenes platform at the same time. So why stop there, we thought? Because this is not the only carbonate platform that was forming in the Mediterranean during the Cretaceous. There's another big one sitting right out here. So we went to look at the seismic over there. We'd been looking at this area for some time. This seismic line runs down from the toe of Italy, running almost due south through the Calabrian Arc. It is famous for the fact you can't see anything at all in there, despite the way I've interpreted it slightly enthusiastically. This is what I think's going on. Can't see it at all on the seismic. But what I can see is right at the end of it, there's a big pile of salt that's built up. So we have the Calabrian Arc. It's an accretionary prism, and it's pushing the Messinian salt in front of it. It's forming this big dome. Does that sound familiar? Because it is. It's a different process, but it's the same phenomenon. And so now if we move from southern Italy down over here to the Cyrenaica margin, and we look at a seismic line that runs from Sirte right the way to the north, so it's a north-south line. This is the usual part that people have been exploring offshore Libya. This is where largely people have been thinking about. The bit I'm interested in is a bit at the end, which is right out here, because here we see the rest of that big pile-up of Messinian salt that's pushed in front of the Calabrian Arc, and it's been pushed over something down here. Now, we've been looking at this for some time, and we couldn't really understand it. We could see areas with no reflectivity, and then areas with good reflectivity, and then areas with no reflectivity. And I couldn't understand how could you generate that? What is going on? Is it just crappy seismic, or is it something real? And then after Zohr was discovered and we'd mapped around all those things, the penny finally dropped, and approached this with Zohr eyes. So here's an example. I'm going to show you just a couple of examples of the data offshore Cyrenaica. And you see this stuff, and it's really it's really coherent, and there's something sitting in here, but you just can't see the reflectivity. Maybe something sitting in there, can't see the reflectivity. One interesting thing about this area is that the Messinian salt is very thick over the top. So we've got our tops here. One thing less to worry about. Here's another example there of the same sort of feature, area of good reflectivity and less reflectivity on either side. So when I do a comparison here between northern Libya and the example that I showed you from northwest of Zohr, remember this example here was 5 times bigger than Zohr. This thing's 10 times bigger than that. Now, the other interesting thing about this part of the world, I know it's just like, no, that can't be true. But, well, you know, it's exploration, so is it true? I don't know. But not overly worried at this point because I'm just kind of excited about the potential. The other interesting thing about this part, the Serenacea, which is...
how long are you going to be excited?
Not very long now. I know Andrew's been waiting to ask that question for at least half an hour. Yes, I know. So the other interesting thing about this area is that it's sitting over a Tethyan-Jurassic rift, so it's probably got a Jurassic source rock at the base of it. So this could be an oil story. Imagine Zor, that's a feature that's 10 times bigger than Zor, but it hasn't got boring gas in it, it's stuffed with oil. That would be something. Anyway, so just to finish then, my final slide. So another quarter of an hour. Yes. Eastern Mediterranean keeps on giving. So this was the bit that I got excited about when I was exploring in the Nile Delta in the 90s, and there's maybe 80 TCF of gas that has been discovered. I can't tell you how many hundreds of wells it took to discover 80 TCF. That would be probably a little embarrassing. 50 TCF discovered offshore Israel. I think there's got to be over 100 TCF. It just takes a couple more of those Zor things to work. You'll be over 100 TCF offshore Cyprus. And when Lebanon Round is announced and that's explored, probably another 50 or so TCF offshore Lebanon. Stop smiling, Andrew. And laughing with me, I hope. And of course, in offshore Lebanon, it might not only be gas, it could be oil. And that's another story for another day. And then just to finish off, perhaps what we're seeing now, we're looking at the Eastern Mediterranean with Zor eyes for the first time. Maybe we've seen something with another 10 billion barrels potential offshore Libya. Thank you very much.
We need people like you when oil prices are low. Well done. That was brilliant. Any questions or comments? You just made everybody go, oh.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, Jeff Boyd, I'm an independent field development planning engineer. I'm not a geologist, hence my question is, what is the significance of Zor being biogenic? Is it common? Is it common? Are there analogues? And does it have the same petroleum system?
Different hydrocarbon systems in other parts of the world have the biogenic gas. And in fact, the Nile Delta is probably 50-50 biogenic gas and thermogenic gas. So what's the difference in terms of engineering and the development? Largely, if it's dry gas, that by definition, you haven't got any fluids. So you can develop it using a subsea tieback. So Tamar, in offshore Israel, that's a dry gas, it's a biogenic gas, it has no liquids at all, and it's developed via a subsea tieback that's 175 kilometres long. Now, if you've got liquids, you'll appreciate that you can't do that sort of long tieback without asking for big trouble. So the advantage for the engineers with all this biogenic gas is that they can develop their fields via subsea tieback, like Zor is going to be developed, my understanding. Via subsea tieback to Thames Field. And you can tie back these fields really quickly. Zor will be on stream within 3 years of discovery, in the same way as Tamar was on stream within 3 years of discovery. And you can develop them really quickly, and you can really move with your exploration to earning something part of the cycle. You can really move it forward. In terms of the pressure, I don't believe that it's overpressured, but I think it's normally pressured, and that's quite common with biogenic gas, although in some parts of the world it's subsequently overpressured.
Does it have the same petroleum system? Does it have the same source and kitchen?
No, it's very different. You don't need a source. All you need is a very low geothermal gradient, and that's where you get the big biogenic finds, is when you have a very low geothermal gradient, so 20 degrees centigrade a kilometre as you go down. The temperature doesn't increase very fast, so it gives you plenty of time for bugs, for the biogenic maturation of methane out of the organic material in the mudstone. Otherwise, if it gets too hot too quickly, the bugs will croak and they can't make the biogenic stuff. So you forget the whole I need a kitchen bit. You don't need it, as long as you have that low geothermal gradient.
Thank you. Any other questions? I've got loads of questions, but I'll leave them. I love that expression. You know it's true if you believe. It's very sort of religious zealousness, but I think great. I mean, really, you know, there's a new play out there. We'd love it not to be a one-off, and you've at least shown the elements of where it could be. Great job, well done. So please join me in thanking Neil.